Faza'il A'mal, More Trouble Than It's Worth, Part 10. Suyuti's Symbols, Zakariyya's Flippancy.
This book, Fada'il al-Amal, by Zakariyya al-Kandalhawi, has mawdu', fabricated ahadith. You can see it in the book that you have. If you have it, pick it up, look at the ahadith, look at the Arabic, you will see it there yourself. And that's why we warn our brothers and sisters not to mess up their aqeedah. These ahadith affect your aqeedah.
In part 10, I'd like to discuss Sheikh Zakariyya's slapdash, inappropriate and flippant approach to hadith science. And in order to do that, I'll use the backbone of this series, which is Dr. Younis Turkistany's research on this book, Fada'il al-Amal, the FA. And in this section, page 194, he's discussing an author, a medieval author called Suyuti, and how Zakariyya used his work, and he erroneously or he inappropriately and flippantly used the work of a Suyuti and used his poor labeling system. So basically, Suyuti wrote a book called Jama as-Saghir, and this book contains a lot of weak hadith, similar to the FA containing a lot of weak and mawdu' fabricated hadith. And what happened was, what Suyuti did in a nutshell is he used a symboling system where he used the letter Sad and the letter H, Ha, and the letter Dad, and he used this to indicate whether the hadith was Sahih, which is rigorously authentic, Hasan, good, and Da'if, which is weak. But the problem is, when you use a single letter, Sad, Ha, Dad, it could be easily confused because these letters look very similar. One of them has only the difference of one diacritical dot. So, people like Ibn al-Mubarak, or scholars like Ibn al-Mubarak, said that Suyuti should have followed every hadith with an indication of its status, whether Sahih, Hasan, or Da'if. And if you'd have done that, his work would have been more beneficial and proficient. So Ibn al-Mubarak is correcting Suyuti and saying his hadith work would have been better if he'd have used an appropriate symbol system and not used these letters Sad, Ha, and Dad. Despite this, Maulana Zakariyya does exactly this. He uses the exact same system as Suyuti, and in doing so, it makes his work a poor form of scholarship. Then he carried, this is the opinion of Turkistany now. This is page 195. There's no obvious difference in symbols between one version and another, the Sad and the Dad, for example. It is not difficult or strange that this distortion occurs in this type of symbol. Therefore, the dependence of Sheikh Zakariyya on a Suyuti symbols is considered inappropriate. So, inappropriate use of hadith symbols there. He also goes further. Finally, we end these points by highlighting that the author generally follows a methodology of expansion and flippancy in dealing with weak ahadith when it comes to Fada'il al-A'mal, Targhib wa Tarhib, and the like. So he's flippant and his use is inappropriate, according to Dr. Turkistany. Now, this is an aside, a total aside, but this issue of confusing letters was something that was present or mentioned by a scholar called Yahya Misho in regards to a medieval scholar called Ibn Taymiyyah. This is totally unrelated to hadith. It's related to geopolitical relations. But the title is called Ibn Taymiyyah's New Modern Fatwa is Genetically Modified Islam GMI Carcinogenic. And it states on this page here how the confusion or the misreading between yu'amala and yuqatala, so words that look very similar when they're handwritten, is one of the main reasons why extremism developed, because one verb simply means to act or to interact with someone, and the other one means to fight someone. So this is a very detailed discussion and I don't want to expand it, but the difference between two dots makes all the difference between interacting with someone and fighting with someone in Arabic. So being flippant in the use of language can lead to disastrous consequences, and in the case of the FA, it has led to disastrous consequences, notwithstanding the appalling behaviour of the publishing houses in this regard. So now we come to the book that will be alternative reading. So enough with the TJ and enough with the AFA. Here is a thesis that was submitted to the University of Edinburgh in the year 2000. It's called Early Hadith Literature and the Theory of Ignaz Goldziher. Now, Ignaz Goldziher is one of the most important figures in the Western study of Hadith literature. In fact, every scholar after Ignaz Goldziher quotes him. People like James Robson, John Burton, Joseph Schatz, Yoon, all these people quote Goldziher, and they're influenced by him. They are people that are critical of Hadith sciences and Hadith methodology, and I give you here, just for your perusal, the detail that this author, Talal Malouch, went into in studying Goldziher's theory. He talked about the companions in the fabrication of Hadith, pious scholars and fabrication. Then he talks about discussions of Hadiths invented by the Umayyads, which was a dynasty, and then he talks about the specific theory of Ignaz Goldziher in relation to Hadith fabrication. So it's a very detailed study of Ignaz Goldziher. It gives a good summary of his life and his beliefs, and then he gives one example, and this is the example I'll give, but this thesis is well worth a read if you want to understand from a Western perspective exactly how Hadith is approached. And the example he gives is this example in the time of the Umayyad Caliph, and it's on page 356 of the thesis that was done at Edinburgh University, and it was talking about an issue that happened early in Islam about the fact that the Quran, which is the primary source text of the religion, how it had been, there was a discussion as to whether if this Quran was created or not. So this is what the footnote says, and it quotes a person that you should be aware of because I've quoted him before in this series, Hamid Mustafa Al-A'zami. If any one of them had been able to fabricate Hadith, the Abbasid Caliph would have done so in the matter of the creation of the Quran, and he would not have forced despotism while he had an army of scholars and judges and theologians and ranks of the Mu'tazila. This was an early intellectual Islamic sect. As an example, I cite the case of Ibn Hanbal. This is Azami quoting. I cite the case of Ibn Hanbal and his clash with the dogma and the creeds of the Caliph and the Mu'tazila sect. He asked the Caliph to bring forward a single hadith of the Prophet that had supported the official view, meaning the view that the Quran was created. But the Caliph, with all his power and all his army of scholars, was unable to produce one, meaning one hadith. The fact that it was impossible to fabricate a hadith on the authority of the Prophet that could go unnoticed by the scholars speaks for itself. So that's a little bit of the history of the study of Western Hadith and just how difficult it is to fabricate Hadith. And that's an excellent example because those scholars, with all their intellectual might, all their intellectual knowledge, all their understanding of the language and the politics and the situation, they simply couldn't bring a hadith into existence and claim this was from the Prophet. Stay tuned for many more parts.